Teaching World War II in Florida, Resources and Strategies from the State Archives of Florida. I am joined today by my partner in archival crime, that is Katrina Harkness, our education officer, and I am the State Archives historian. And so we've got a great program today put together for you about teaching World War II in Florida and some of the wonderful resources that we have available for you for tackling this interesting subject. Just a couple of things, because I see that we have a pretty varied group today. We've got a lot of teachers and curriculum professionals in the crowd. We've also got some folks from museums and libraries, and it's kind of a mixed group. So just to make sure everybody kind of knows what the State Archives is and kind of how we fit into the picture for coming up with great resources for teaching World War II and other topics. We are the State Archives of Florida. We're physically located 2 blocks behind the state capitol in Tallahassee, in the R.A. Gray building. It's one of the best buildings in Tallahassee for learning about Florida history. We've got the State Library, the State Archives, the Museum of Florida History, lots of great stuff. And we, the Archives, are the official repository for Florida's state government records. We also have a lot of local government records, private manuscript collections, things like diaries and letters, and extensive collections of film, photographs, and sound recordings. And for those of you out there who are teachers and curriculum development professionals and that sort of thing, what that means is primary sources, lots and lots of different kinds of primary sources illustrating every imaginable angle of Florida history. And so we do hope that you take advantage of those things. There's oftentimes a misconception that the State Archives are not really accessible for folks outside of the professional historical circle, or that it's only for people working in government, and that's just not true at all. Teachers and students are just as welcome to engage with these extensive public collections as anybody else, and it's our pleasure and honor today to bring some of that to you regarding World War II. So just to remind everybody, on the teaching side, we do have several standards, mainly in the 4th grade and high school curriculum that pertain to World War II. You guys know about these already. I just put these up to remind you that not only do we see World War II pop up in standards about Florida history in general, but we also have a number of standards that deal with World War II in the United States, and Florida is sort of brought into that as a way of demonstrating some of these things about World War II that we teach about. So, okay. Let's start off by just pointing out a couple of things about why Florida is such an awesome place to teach.
Josh, I'm going to stop you just for a second.
Okay.
Can you guys let us know that you can hear us? We just had somebody that's having some audio issues, and we just want to double check real quick to make sure that the audio is coming through. On our end, okay, great. Loud and clear. Perfect. Carry on.
All right, just making sure we're in good shape. So Florida is an awesome place to teach about World War II for 2 main reasons. Number one, Florida experienced all of the big issues that come up in the educational standards, whether you're teaching about Florida history in the 4th grade, or if you're teaching about United States history in the 11th grade in high school, or if you're just working on something like Veterans Day or Congressional Medal of Honor or things like that at any grade. All the big topics have a place, ways of illustrating all those big topics here in Florida. Military training, defense industries, and the labor situation that goes along with that. African American participation, both in the military and on the home front, that double V victory concept. Scrap drives, bond drives, rationing, block leaders, civilian defense measures, all of this stuff comes up within the context of Florida history. And so you can find lots of great topics within Florida's participation in World War II to share regarding all that. The second big reason why Florida is such a great place to teach about World War II is that Florida, being on the coast and just being in the situation that it was in the 1940s, has a lot of interesting, unique, dramatic events that are attached to its own World War II history. Things like coastal blackouts. And I don't just mean blackouts in theory. There were people all over the United States who were practicing blackouts, even very far inland, just in case they became necessary. But here in Florida, we actually needed to have blackouts. They were necessary to avoid having submarines sinking Allied shipping and that sort of thing. We had submarine attacks off of our coastline here. We had an enormous training center here, including for all aspects of military action in World War II, including amphibious warfare. And we also had cases of attempted sabotage here in Florida. So there's a lot of really interesting things that you can use as a hook to grab those students who, you get some who really are into this sort of thing, and then some, their eyes just sort of glaze over as soon as you start talking about military history and things like that. And so what we want to do today is just share a little bit about some of those really cool, interesting entry points that will help you really bring World War II to life in the classroom. And then we want to show you some of the things that we have available on the Florida Memory website that will help you bring those stories to life in your classroom, and at the same time give you some great opportunities for primary source analysis, lots of different kinds. Now, this is not an exhaustive overview of World War II. We focused mainly on how World War II shows up in the standards and the things that cleave mostly to the way that teachers tend to bring up World War II in classes. There may be some new things in here that you haven't encountered before, but we certainly do want to make sure that we just hit the high points here. Okay, and then we'll close off after we get finished with our major themes and showing you some things on the Florida Memory website. We'll close off by talking about some undigitized resources that are not yet on Florida Memory, but we do have them here in the State Archives, and they're super easy to request. All right, so let's kick off with our first major theme, and that's getting into the war. One of the hardest parts, or at least it's the hardest part for me in teaching World War II to young students who may not be familiar with all the different aspects of how World War II gets started, is that World War II doesn't actually start with Pearl Harbor. Even the United States story with World War II doesn't start with Pearl Harbor. Far from it. You've got the war starting off in Asia essentially 10 years before Pearl Harbor occurs, when the Japanese begin expanding into Asia. In Europe, of course, you've got the drama with Weimar Germany starting to fall apart and the rise of Hitler. So there's a lot on the stove already cooking well before the United States is actively involved in the conflict. The other piece that I think is oftentimes hard to get across to students is that there was actually an honest debate as to whether the United States should get involved in this conflict. It's hard, the way that we think about World War II in the past. I mean, think of all of the sort of triumphalist cartoons and movies and all of these themes where it almost seems inevitable that the United States would come in and sort of save the day on the Allied side during the course of this war. It's very hard for a lot of folks to conceptualize that trope of course America's going to be 100% in this fight, in it to win it until it's all completely over with, that doesn't really get rolling until after 1941. Prior to that, there are folks on both sides calling for the United States to either be to intervene proactively on the side of the Allies. There's folks in the middle who are saying, well, maybe we won't intervene actively, but we'll at least build up the United States military to be prepared in the event that these massive oceans on either side of us are not sufficient to keep the Axis out. And then you got people on the other side saying this really isn't the United States fight. The United States should remain completely neutral in this conflict to avoid getting involved in something like World War I. There were still a lot of very raw memories about that. And a lot of folks who believed that the United States had gotten dragged into World War I by the munitions industries and bankers and that sort of thing. So there really is an honest debate here that's going on. And Floridians are having this debate the same as everybody else. You've got folks, as I say, who were really strongly in favor of intervention at some form, preserving American neutrality, but still doing whatever was possible to aid the other allies at this point, Great Britain and France. And then you've got folks who believe that the United States has no business being in this. And what I have here on the screen here are a couple of examples. Now, all of the records, all the documents and photos that we show in this presentation are available on floridamemory.com, and you can see the URLs that'll take you directly to these documents that we show them as we show them here on the screen. What we've got here on the left here is an example of somebody high up in Florida government. This is Governor Fred P. Cone. He's governor from 1937 to 1941. And he's writing this telegram here. This is a copy of a telegram that went to President Roosevelt praising Roosevelt for his destroyers for bases deal. That's the one where we gave a bunch of old destroyers to Great Britain in return for being able to put military bases on some of the British possessions in the Caribbean. And so you can actually see here an example of there we go. We've blown it up just a little bit. You can see Governor Cone congratulating President Roosevelt, and this is actually a pretty common thing for some of Florida's politicians to weigh in on these kinds of issues. Pat Cannon, who was a congressman from Florida at this time, he also was pretty significantly on the side of President Roosevelt's policy of aiding the Allies wherever possible. In fact, he makes a statement to his constituents about why exactly this is necessary, trying to sort of explain to Floridians why he's taking aside an interventionist stance in this issue. And you can see that statement by Congressman Cannon, by the way, in one of our primary source sets that Katrina is going to describe to you a little later on in the program. Claude Pepper, who was one of our United States senators, was also one of a very outspoken person in favor of military preparedness on the part of the United States and intervention in so much as it was possible with America's neutrality policy and neutrality laws to aid the British and the French as much as possible. Now, on the other side of the coin, you've got folks who believed that the United States did not really have a dog in this fight, and that it was dangerous for the U.S. to get involved because it would, if the U.S. was not already involved in sort of a full-blown war, that it would lead to that, even if we just gave the British and French a little bit of help. And I've got over here an example. This is a postcard that came from a woman down in Miami Beach. And she wrote in, now this is earlier in the war. Let's see if we can get, so the postmark here is 1940. So and let's see, it's June 1940. So at this point, Pearl Harbor hasn't happened. Some of the lead up to Pearl Harbor that was starting to turn the tide of public opinion towards United States participation in the war had not happened just yet. And so at this point, all that's really on the table is the United States is being asked to provide, certain materiel to the Allies, and in this case, actually help British children, potential refugees, because Great Britain at this time is under attack, to provide them shelter, an asylum here in the United States. And this person in Miami Beach is actually saying, we can't accept children into Florida. They should go someplace else in the British Empire, Canada, Australia, South Africa. Our own kids here in Florida are undernourished and poorly housed. Remember, this is at the tail end of the Great Depression, so this is still, the scarcity of certain resources is still very much on people's minds. And so, she's saying this is not our fight. And this is something that you see in a lot of newspaper editorials at this time. We quote from a few of those in the history that we provide in our World War II Learning Unit. There are a lot of folks who believe that Claude Pepper, who I mentioned was one of the most outspoken advocates of more intervention, more preparedness, and more help for the Allies. There were a lot of folks who believed that Claude Pepper's mouth was essentially going to get the United States into World War II if it didn't get in some other way. So there's a lot of pushback, actually, against United States intervention right here in Florida, just as much as there was advocacy for preparedness and intervention on behalf of the Allies. So that is one way that we can talk about that through primary sources. Civil defense. Florida, as you can imagine, was especially vulnerable to attack. It's not hard to get students to see that. Look at this. We've got 8,436 miles of coastline by one metric. And it's not just theoretical, the idea that Florida could become the subject of attack. If you think about, Florida's coastline and the waters just off the coast of Florida, Florida really did experience attacks. In the vicinity of Florida. You could actually see ships that were fired on by submarines in the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf, and you could actually see those ships burning. Okay, so it was not just a theoretical threat. There was the possibility of attack by air or by submarine here in Florida. And with so many people away from Florida, so many men going into the military, there was certainly a feeling that civilian defense measures needed to be put in place. And just a little statistic talking about things being sunk off the coast. 24 ships are sunk off the coast of Florida during the course of the war. So, and the other thing is, you know, Florida did have a strong military presence here, but these are trainees. We had 2 million men who were trained for military service in Florida during the course of the war. 2 million men. But remember, these guys are trainees. Some of them are coming fresh off the bus from their hometown. They can't necessarily count as a force that's going to be the first line of defense in Florida, in the event of an attack. And let's also keep in mind that they're mainly, if you follow the cursor of my mouse here, they're mainly concentrated in just a few places. You've got Camp Blanding up here in Clay County. You've got Camp Gordon Johnston over here in the Panhandle. You got a bunch of flyboys down here in Miami Beach being trained. You got a few other installations like right here around Tampa, and you've got a couple other smaller ones scattered about. But those guys are not like on the alert for coastal defense. And so it was felt very early on, well before Pearl Harbor even, that steps needed to be taken to protect Florida's coastline. So a few things that actually happened with that. I mentioned that so many folks are off in the military. The Florida National Guard actually gets activated for federal service in 1940, and so all of a sudden Florida has no National Guard, and that's who we usually turn to in the event of some kind of civil disturbance or some kind of sudden attack on our homeland. So the state government actually replaces the Florida National Guard with a secondary state defense force. Also, you see a number of auxiliary police forces and auxiliary fire departments develop all across the state. Those are typically managed through what is called local defense councils, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So there's that. Also, the possibility of air attacks. Remember that World War II is when we actually get flight technology to the point that you can actually fly several, different kinds of aircraft across the Atlantic or from any base in Central or South America. If one had been established, the chances of the Axis being able to attack Florida from the air increased dramatically over what it would have been just a few years before World War II begins. And so in order to deal with that, there's no radar at this time. Radar is still very much in its infancy, and it's not very well widespread in the area. So ground observation posts end up being the main answer here. And it's not military personnel who are manning these ground observation posts. It's actually civilians, older folks who were not eligible for military service, women, Boy Scouts, even children. Lots of children are actually helping out to spot aircraft from these observation posts all over the course of the state. If you look at this map that I have here in the center, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see a little better what we're talking about. What we're looking at here, this is a map showing you all of the ground observation posts all over the state of Florida during the course of the war. And it's showing you the number that had actually been organized and the number that they wanted to organize. And you can see that there's a little bit of a disparity between those numbers. Again, these are civilian volunteers. These are not military personnel who are staffing these. And you can see that the numbers tend to go up around key strategic locations and, of course, along the coastline. And the idea was that these people would watch the air, they would look for aircraft, identify that aircraft, and then report that information in by telephone to a central center to the military so that the military could track these aircraft. We have a number of really great photographs of this online that you can look at to see how that goes. Submarine attacks. Now, as far as the submarine attacks goes, again, these actually happened. This is not theoretical. We did have 24 ships sunk off the coast of Florida during the war. One of the biggest problems that civilians could actually control was the fact that Allied shipping passing across the Florida coastline at night, they created silhouettes against brightly lit coastlines. And so it was easier if you've got out here in the Atlantic, if you look at my cursor, if you've got an Axis submarine, a German or Italian submarine out here, and there's Allied shipping passing in between that submarine and the bright lights of, say, Jacksonville or Melbourne or Miami down here, what happens is when those dark ships go past those bright lights, it creates a great target, almost as good as that target would be during the daytime, and the submarines are able to get very close without being as easily detected. And there are actually a number of ships that get sunk. We have, for example, a telegram right here in the bottom right where somebody is saying, hey, this ship got sunk in the evening here, and don't you think the bright lights might have something to do with that? Shouldn't we maybe do some blackouts or something like that to prevent this destruction from happening? And so blackouts end up becoming one of the best civilian weapons to defensive weapons to prevent these sinkings. And so you see that these coastal communities in Florida actually develop these blackout procedures. And we've got a number of primary sources that relate to that. This telegram is one of my favorites. We also have entire booklets of air raid and blackout precautions that are available on Florida Memory. Last but not least, as far as civilian defense, there was always a fear of potential sabotage. So there's a lot of concern about keeping close tabs on individuals of foreign birth, people who don't appear to be from a community, people sort of watching out in their neighborhood for unfamiliar persons. And this was with good reason to some extent, because we did actually experience a case of attempted sabotage here in Florida. In 1942, the Germans attempted what was called Operation Pastorius. There were two groups of would-be saboteurs. One was turned loose right off the coast of Ponte Vedra Beach, just south of Jacksonville. Another group of coordinating saboteurs was turned loose off of Long Island, and they came in and they actually attempted to go, and their plan was to destroy or disrupt at least several pieces of American infrastructure, and they were going to sort of meet up in a pincer movement to take these things on. And these guys actually made it as far as Jacksonville to get on a bus, and some of them even made it to other parts of the United States before they were finally captured, thanks in part to the fact that one of the saboteurs in New York actually came clean and went to the authorities up there in New York. But so this was an actual, very real, not theoretical, fear that this sort of thing could happen. All right, let's bump to the next slide here. As far as civilian participation is concerned, Florida had a very highly organized system for identifying civilian defense needs and coming up with the volunteers necessary to fulfill those needs. Now, from a federal perspective, you had an Office of Civilian Defense that operated in Washington that kind of coordinated the needs of all these different alphabet agencies that were doing things to support the war effort. The people who came up with the ration book system, the people who came up with that ground observation corps system, the Civil Air Patrol, the people who are coming up with the Selective Service system. All of those different folks coordinated with the Office of Civilian Defense in Washington, D.C., to figure out how to get civilian volunteers piped into these systems to keep all of them running smoothly. Now, the Office of Civilian Defense, they coordinated a series of state defense councils. Each state had its own state defense council that kind of took its marching orders from that Office of Civilian Defense in Washington, and also developed other efforts that made sense for their particular state. And then within each state, there were local defense councils that would carry out all of these directives that were coming from Washington, from the state capitals, Tallahassee in our case, of course. And those local councils would actually be the boots on the ground, so to speak, getting all of these civilian volunteers to take on tasks like child care for working mothers who are working in defense industries, training people for first aid, developing ride-sharing programs so that fewer automobiles and gasoline was being used, that sort of thing. And we had 130 of those local councils right here in Florida. Every county had one, and many of the smaller communities had one as well. We're going to talk about how you get your hands on the records from those. It's super easy to do, and we know that they'd be great for you to use in your classrooms. Now, we've talked a little bit about some of the tasks that these local civilian groups are handling. In addition to the ones that I mentioned, these are also the groups that are coordinating scrap drives, scrap metal, scrap paper, scrap grease, everything you can imagine. These folks are organizing drives to collect this stuff. Also, the food supply control things like victory gardens and people setting up canning factories so that food could be canned and preserved to limit the amount of food that people were going to the grocery store and purchasing. That way, more processed food like that could be funneled into the military and into strategic locations in the United States that could not produce their own food the way that we could a little easier here in Florida. Everybody is involved in these tasks. Women, African Americans, even children. And I think that's one angle where it's very interesting to get students to see this, because I think it helps them see themselves or children like themselves in the war and helps to make the experience more relatable. Just a couple of documents that I've got up here to sort of show you in this case. We've got here, this is a poster that shows all of the different insignia for all of the different civil defense categories, all the different categories of volunteers that were being recruited in these defense councils all over the United States. And then if you shift over to this other document, again, if I'm moving too quickly and you're not getting to see everything, remember that all of this is available on floridamemory.com. Also, this presentation will be available for you to view on our YouTube channel when this is over with. But you can see all of the different kinds of volunteering things. Some of these are one-off things like donating blood. Some of these things are long-term commitments, like learning first aid and being on tap for that, working with folks who are doing recreational things, training Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, knitting, you name it. There's just all kinds of things going on. I should mention that in this particular document, this is being sent out from the State Defense Council to local defense councils asking what are the African Americans doing in your community to volunteer. That is because, like most public institutions in the South at this time, civilian defense efforts were segregated. Okay. And one example for with the students, one of the ways that students were able to help out, and there were a number of things that kids did, serving as messengers because remember, telephones are on switchboards at this time. That means every time you place a telephone call, you tie up a telephone operator who has to sit there and switch out the cords to connect you to whoever you're going with. You've got messenger services. Kids are great for that sort of thing. Bond sales, first aid and crowd control training. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are doing a lot of that. A lot of the Girl Scouts at this time were learning how to knit and learning how to sew and actually putting things together for refugee aid programs and stuff like that. But one of the biggest is scrap collection, especially scrap metal. Kids are amazing at this sort of thing. They're super cute. They go up and say, hey, do you have any scrap pots and pans? It's free. It doesn't cost anybody anything. And they are really great at collecting scrap at this time. And so to give you an example of just how powerful this group of folks was, there was a program in 1942 that it was a partnership between the newspapers of the state and the State Department of Education, and it was called the Junior Scrap Army Drive, and it was a drive to collect scrap metal, and it was great. They gave every school superintendent was like a colonel, and then every principal was a major, and then they had lieutenants in every classroom, and the kids were all privates, and it was just an amazing, military-like thing. It really made the kids feel like they were making a huge difference, because they were in this war effort. And during the course of a few months in 1942, those kids, the school children of Florida, collected 30 million tons of scrap metal in just a few weeks. 30 million tons. The winners of, the folks who collected the most scrap, they actually let them go over to Mobile, Alabama, and participate in the inauguration ceremony for one of the Liberty ships, the Colin Kelly, which was over in Mobile in those ships. But I have up here an example of one of the documents that we have pertaining to that drive. This is a progress report that was sent out by the State Department of Education showing the progress for each county. And we have this on Florida Memory. It's in our primary source set talking about scrap drives. And how cool is it to be able to go in and find your county and show students what was going on with kids their age exactly in your hometown. What a great connection to be able to make. Moving on to our next slide here. Another cool aspect Florida is a critical training area for all branches of the military during the course of the war. The reason for this is we've got lots and lots of space. We're a primarily rural state at that time. We have varied terrain here in Florida that matches up with the needs that so many different aspects of the military needed, including the folks who were training for those very dramatic amphibious invasions in the Pacific and in Normandy, in France. We also have the most amazing climate here. I know that sometimes we're sweating in the summer, and that can always be kind of difficult for us now. But when you're trying to have the bare minimum necessary to train a military and do that year round, Florida is a great place for it. More than 2 million service members trained during Florida during the course of the war. That's a quarter of all Air Force officers and a fifth of all of the enlisted airmen actually trained right there in Miami Beach, just to break that down even farther, which was great for Miami Beach because the tourist industry, as you can imagine, takes a little bit of a dive right at the beginning of the war. There's so many restrictions, so many guys are going off to fight, so many other folks have so many disruptions in their lives that the last thing on their mind is taking a vacation. But thankfully, the United States military is able to work out a deal with the hotels in Miami and in other places and fill those hotel rooms up with men who are training on the beaches and training in those coastal communities. Many of the men who participated in the dramatic amphibious landings at Normandy and in the Pacific, they trained at Camp Gordon Johnston over in the Panhandle. If you know where Carabel is, or St. George Island, that area was sort of ground zero for training for D-Day and a number of other amphibious invasions. And Camp Blanding, which we have a map of Camp Blanding right here on the screen. I'm going to blow that up just a little bit for you. Okay. Camp Blanding had so many men training there at Camp Blanding at one point that it was the 4th largest city in the state during the course of the war. We also had a WAC training center. Those women accepted for, that's Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. I think I've got that right. Don't quote me on that. But we had a WAC training center in Daytona Beach. Mary McLeod Bethune, of course, is the founder of Bethune-Cookman, what became Bethune-Cookman University over there. She was instrumental in getting that one established. It was only the second WAC training center that had been established, so it came into the picture very early on. As you can imagine, all of this has a tremendous effect during the course of the war because all of these people, these millions of people who passed through Florida to train for service, they're getting a chance to see Florida and to fall in love with Florida. And many of them do come back after the war either as visitors or as permanent residents. Many folks do move to Florida permanently who had served in Florida during the course of the war who received training here. So a huge effect. We also have a number of significant Floridians who are associated with this. This ties directly in with that standard in the grade 9 through 12 curriculum where it's asking you to discuss the roles of prominent Floridians and prominent Florida issues and how that relates to United States history. As I mentioned, Claude Pepper was a very outspoken advocate of President Roosevelt's policies regarding military preparedness and intervention on behalf of the Allies. And so he doesn't, in the curriculum, in the textbooks, I oftentimes don't see him come up quite as much as perhaps he should. Again, there were a number of Florida newspapers that were sometimes wondering whether Claude Pepper's pronouncements on the floor of the United States Senate were going to sort of catapult us into war maybe faster than we would have otherwise. We also have two prominent African-American leaders who were Floridians, who were at least born in Florida. A. Philip Randolph spent most of his life outside of Florida, but he was born in Jacksonville. And he was instrumental in getting the Roosevelt administration to push through Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in defense industries. Randolph had planned a 50,000-man march through the streets of Washington to protest discrimination in the military and defense industries. And Roosevelt met with him prior to that, trying to get him to call this off and saying that this wasn't the right approach. But Randolph said, I'm sorry, these are very real issues, and this is something that we plan to do. And Roosevelt's administration ended up deciding that the best thing to do was to go ahead and put through that executive order prohibiting discrimination in defense industries. It's not a 100% fix. As we know, there's still tremendous discrimination in defense industries and in the military after this, but it is a step in the right direction, and it was a Floridian who helped to establish that first step. Mary McLeod Bethune, as I mentioned, she does help us get that WAC training center down here in Florida. She had been an advisor in Roosevelt's administration, part of what in the 1930s was nicknamed the Black Cabinet, so to speak. She was one of the original advisors on that Black Cabinet and was a constant advocate of more and more equitable roles for African Americans in the military and in the defense industry and in other New Deal agencies like the National Youth Administration and that sort of thing. So we've got some great Floridian presence in the story of World War II. Very important to point that out. And last but not least, on the defense and on the sort of major themes, we've got the defense industries that were here in Florida. We weren't really a very big industrial state at this time, mainly agricultural, but we did have one really important industry here that's prominent in the war effort, and that is shipbuilding. Lots of Liberty ships being built in Jacksonville, Tampa, and Panama City especially, and some other things being built in other places, but those are your really big places for sure. And what's particularly remarkable about this is that a lot of women are involved in this. A lot of women are doing because there's just the men who would typically have been doing the riveting and the sawing and the operating of power tools and all these things that were formerly thought to be strictly the province of men. Women stepped into those roles in a big way, and we have a lot of photographic evidence of this. We have, it generates a lot of issues in communities like what do we do with the kids when mom's at work? And what do we do, with how do we structure women's time and their family obligations so that they can actually do these things? And it's interesting to see in the documents and the photographs how this plays out. And there's a lot on Florida Memory to help you do that. Agriculture is our other big industry. The price of cotton doubles during the war, so that's big for us up here in North Florida. In South and Central Florida, you've got the citrus industry, which is huge at this time. The 1942-1943 citrus crop is 80 million boxes. That's even more than California produced that year. And that was the first time in a very long time that Florida's citrus crop had actually surpassed that California. And the U.S. government was buying virtually the entire citrus crop to make it available for our soldiers and people in strategic parts of the United States. And it's important to mention that World War II sort of provoked something that we became known for later. There were scientists at the University of Florida and the Florida Citrus Commission who developed one of the first methods for creating frozen concentrates so that that stuff could be transported all over the place. All right. Well, I think that's enough on the major themes. I think I'm going to kick it over to Katrina here. We'll get her to get control of her screen, and then she'll talk a little bit about what we have online.
Thanks, Josh. So we're looking at, show my screen, yes, we're looking at Florida Memory here. This is the classroom section, and we have 15 learning units that are here that touch on some of the major themes in Florida history. We've chosen these topics because they meet the standards, and also they are topics for which we have some really great primary source material. I'm going to show you something. We have recently revised the World War II learning unit. It's not online yet, so you're going to be seeing some of the first people to see this. I'm going to sneak you over here to this test site, and this will be up next year. Next week. Florida during World War II. You can look for it next week. So here on the front page, we have pretty much a summary of the history of Florida in World War II. This is the material that Josh just covered. And some of the subsections here, we have a photographic page for students, a timeline, 4 primary source sets, which contain the documents that we were talking about. Here's civil defense here, and military training in Florida. Now, the second document here is a video. I can't play it for you because of the limitations of our broadband, but this is a great film for actually showing troops training for amphibious warfare, and you can tell that some of them are not native Floridians because they are camouflaging themselves with Spanish moss, and just watching them drape themselves in that Spanish moss makes me itch to see it. But that's a great film to watch. It is silent, just to let you know. So coming down on the front page, some of the documents we have to look at. I'm sorry here, we've got a little glitch. I'm going to redirect this. Boom, boom. Okay. So when I was in the classroom, as Josh mentioned, one of the first things you want to do when you're working with primary source documents is trying to get kids' attention. And one thing that screenwriters have found is if you want to grab the audience's attention right off, first thing, what you want to do is put the dog in danger. So the Defense Counsel knew that exact same thing. They have to get the attention of a whole lot of people when they're talking about rationing. So we have a press release that talks about how is rationing going to affect Fido or Kitty. So we know people are going to be affected by rationing, but what's it going to mean for the dogs or cats? Melissa's going to share out a link for the Share the Meat program so that you can look at this a little more closely. But what it tells you is that cats and dogs are not included in the rationing. At this time, dogs generally ate meat and were fed with table scraps. And so the meat rationing does not allow for that. And the Defense Counsel is suggesting that you feed dehydrated food to your dogs. It would be a little bit too much of an exaggeration to say that World War II invented dry dog food, but they were is a big factor in the switch to that being popular in popular thing to feed your cats. And they do let you know that your cat can still eat fish because fish is not going to be under this rationing system. Moving down to the next document, I really like working with telegrams because they are short and to the point. People had to pay per word, so people get to the point very quickly. And if I'll give you a second to just take a look at this, and if we were going to do a really quick analysis of this, I like the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. So let's take a look and see, who do you think this telegram is to? And I'm seeing here at the top, General Albert Blanding. Who is it from? Down here, Phil May. Where are we talking about? Well, I see in this header Jacksonville, and then in the text I'm talking about Jacksonville Beach. When is a little bit tricky. Up here there's some really tiny faint writing. So I'm going to zoom on this. I'm going to follow this link, which is going to take me to the document on its page. And then from here I'm going to click one more time to zoom in on it. And we're going to get really close and see if we can look at that tiny faint writing there. And you can see just barely that this is 1942, April 12th at 12:56 p.m. So this is 1942. Now there is a lot to look at in this telegram, but let's start with just the basics. 2 American ships were destroyed off the coast opposite Jacksonville Beach Friday night. It is reasonable to assume the submarine was aided by the lights of the amusement concessions. Is it not desirable to protect ships using this vital lane from that danger? So this touches on what Josh was talking about earlier. There was an attack by a submarine on an American ship. It was actually just one ship. They initially thought it was 2. And they're talking about the need to take some blackout precautions in the future. Now, I did a little more in-depth research, wanting to know a little bit more about this event. I had heard that a lot of these submarine attacks were not written about in the newspapers at this time because the government was trying to keep people from panicking, trying to keep this situation kind of under wraps. And so I went and did a search, and it turns out the ship that was attacked was the Gulf America. I was able to find in the newspapers a mention of the christening, and then later in 1945 learn about the crew members that had died, but nothing in 1942 was written about this. So what we have to go on to learn more about these attacks really are the primary source documents here. So this document's a little bit like an accordion in that you can do a really quick summary. If you just want to introduce the concept of what's happening, you can just do the 5 W's. If you want to go a little deeper, you can talk about how this relates to the entire system of civic defense along the coast. When we go back and up and look at the lesson plans, we have a couple for 4th grade we can look at. And this is one on rationing. This is one of Josh's favorite, and the more I get to know it, the more I like it. You can, and Melissa can send this out for us to take a look at. But you can analyze this by reading it like a comic strip, like a 2-panel comic strip. So what do we see as the story going on here? What's happening? And you can see the details in the document. There are some little details like how much meat is hanging in the back that change from the first panel to the second. So the story is urging people to ration, to share fairly among, so that everybody gets a fair share.
And we love posters for working. You know, one of the nice things about posters is that if you've got students of different reading levels, you know, in the classroom, these are great to have a discussion with. They're still doing primary source analysis. They're still being, you know, forced to, you know, to spend some time really giving these things a deep look. But everybody gets a chance to participate. So combining this document with maybe some of the other textual ones is a great way to make sure you're getting full participation from the entire class, even if you've got varying ability levels.
Thanks, Josh. And another document that you looked at just a little bit earlier, and Josh touched on this, is Camp Blanding. This is a document that was given to soldiers at Camp Blanding when they arrived. And this does a really good job of talking about, in a really quick summary, exactly how the military training facilities changed the face of Florida, starting with just a kind of a wild, open piece of land to what became the 4th largest city. And it has a lot of facilities. If you talk to your students about what you might find on a military base, it might have some things they wouldn't expect, like its own fire department, a hospital, telephone, a bowling alley. So you can use that document to really get, and the more you, this is kind of a long document at 24 pages, but there's some really interesting pieces about what exactly it is like on base and to be a soldier on that base. And so those are some good ways to get into the documents. And Josh is going to talk a little bit more about what you can do when you want to go above and beyond what's available online.
Okay. So, all right. So we've taken a look now at some of the resources that we have in the online classroom. But let's talk a little bit about some of the other things on Florida Memory that we have available for you. Now, when Katrina puts together these learning units, what we do is we look at the standards and we try to find the most applicable primary source documents, the most applicable bits of the story of those units, be it, you know, World War II or Zora Neale Hurston or Florida in the Civil War or the Seminoles or whatever, and try to focus on just the most valuable pieces that are going to get you right on top of those standards, because we know your time is valuable. We know that you have a very limited time to teach a large amount of stuff. But it's important that you understand, number one, that Florida Memory, writ large, has more than what's in the learning units if you want it. And the State Archives of Florida has much more than what's available on Florida Memory, if you want it. So let's talk a little bit about how once you've gone through the learning units, you've seen what's in there, you've seen the primary sources, and you're wondering, is there more? There is. Okay, if I run a search for World War II. And I'm putting it in quotation marks because I don't want, things with just the word world or just the word war. I want exactly this phrase. If I put that into a top-level search in Florida Memory, I can very quickly see by looking over on the right-hand side here, this nice facet here that shows me all of the different things that are available in Florida Memory relating to this. More than 1,600 photographs, more than 140 selected documents, which I'm going to show you a little bit about what those are coming up soon. Lots of blog posts where we've talked about all kinds of different aspects of the war, like training for flight, or the scrap collection drives, or maybe those auxiliary police forces and what it was like to be part of those. And then just a number of different things here. You can see that the primary source sets that Katrina has put together is in here. We've got research tools for folks in your class who are starting out on Florida History Day projects and that sort of thing. We've got films such as the Wakulla Springs film that Katrina was showing you. We also have training footage from down at Sarasota Army Airfield, that sort of thing. Lots of great resources. One of the best ones for getting at those posters, like we were showing you the one with the rationing issue there. Let me show you a quick way to get to those. We have what we call our selected documents collection, and this is kind of a grab bag. Anytime that we decide that we're not going to digitize an entire collection, everything that you see on this collection page, for the most part, we've digitized the entire collection that's there. All of the 1845 election returns, all of the freedmen's contracts that we have for Jefferson County. But selected documents, we use this collection for when we find something really super cool in a collection, but we just don't have the resources to digitize the entire collection. And we use this to do all kinds of things. There's a number of different ways you can slice and dice this, but one of the quickest ways to see what we have in this collection for World War II is to look under period right here. And you'll find that we actually have Florida during World War II as one of the sort of chapters of Florida history that you can look on. Now, let me go ahead and warn you ahead of time. There's a number of posters and things that in this section that were aimed at soldiers who were very young soldiers who were training in the state, and they were warning them against venereal disease. So you're going to see a lot of posters relating to that, such as help beat the Axis with prophylaxis and such. So just use discretion when unleashing this particular section of the site on your students. But there's just, look at this. We've got, a piece of ephemera. This is a leaflet that would have been handed out to farming families in Leon County, explaining to them why they should plant more acreage in food crops rather than maybe cotton or tung nuts or something like that. Okay. Other things, we've got a brochure that's encouraging people to volunteer on farms. Other great posters. I mean, let's see if I can find one of my favorite ones here. Look at this one. I mean, look at all that there is to unpack in this. I mean, we can talk about gender with this. We can talk about why is it necessary in this moment for people to be canning. Why is there any question that there would be enough food to eat during the winter? What's that all about? These posters are excellent places to begin all kinds of discussions with your students. And one of my favorite strategies, and I've shamelessly stolen this from the National World War II Museum, is actually to give these to students without the words. Get them to just look at the pictures and see if they can figure out what the posters are all about just with the pictures alone. Especially with one like, oh my goodness, I do hope it's right here in the beginning. There's one where a housewife is just feeding cans, aluminum cans, directly into a machine gun. Please tell me that I've got this here somewhere to show it to you. Let's see if I can find this. Let's see, poster, aluminum cans. Oh, darn, I'm not going to be able to get it right offhand. But anyway, it's in here somewhere. You'll be able to find it. And there's just lots of great stuff like that in the section. Now, having said that about the Florida Memory website, another thing I mentioned is that Florida Memory has only a certain amount of what we have in the State Archives. The State Archives of Florida has 50,000 cubic feet of records, a massive amount of material. Florida Memory, even with, let me just show you here, We've got, look at the hundreds of thousands of records that we have in here. Even with all of that, Florida Memory has less than 1% of the total holdings of the state archives digitized. What that means for you is that depending on what kinds of primary sources you would like to have for your next unit that's going to touch on Florida history in some way, there are likely multitudes of primary sources available here. And Katrina and I love nothing more than to get a request from you guys for primary sources about X. You don't even need to know what they are. Just tell us the topic that you're working with. We'll run a search on the archives holdings of things that aren't digitized. We'll find what we can and get it to you. I want to close by saying that the most relevant collection for World War II that we have on this, if you remember back to us talking about civilian defense and that hierarchy of civilian defense organizations, starting with the Office of Civilian Defense down to the State Defense Council, and then those 130 local defense councils, we have the records of the State Defense Council and their correspondence with all of those 130 local defense councils. We have those right here at the State Archives of Florida, and we can make copies of those records for you. So if, say, for example, you're in Nassau County and you would like to, for your students to have an opportunity to see the kinds of records that talk about what was going on in Nassau County regarding civilian defense and volunteer efforts and scrap drives and bond drives and stuff like that, all we need is an email from you saying, hey, I'm doing this for a class, and this is what I want to cover in the class. What kinds of records can you get me on what's going on in Nassau County during the war? That's all we need to know. With that request alone, we'll be able to go in and get that information for you. That's a special service that we do for teachers, and we love, and curriculum development folks as well. So we'd be very glad to hear from you on those issues. I think that that's all the material that Katrina and I have. We'd like to open up the floor for your questions.
And this is Melissa. Again, just reminding you, questions, you can type them into chat. We'll make sure that all of your questions and comments get addressed. How do we find your YouTube channel? Well, that's a great question, Lori. We will be sending out a link to the recording after the session. So you will be getting a link to our YouTube channel. Okay.
And you'll get that direct link, but just in case you happen to be without that link at some point, if you go to youtube.com and just type in Florida Bureau Library Development, you're going to get right to us. And I know that it's the State Archives. The State Archives doesn't actually have its own YouTube channel. All of the stuff in our division goes through the Bureau of Library Development because they're the ones who do our webinars and keep us tuned in and turned up. And all of our videos that we create, they go right in here. We have a variety of different videos on genealogy and all kinds of stuff pertaining to libraries and history. Lots of good stuff.
She says, great, thanks. Maria says, can the email request you described be submitted by curators for exhibits too?
When we do the requests that we have, what we can do for that is we can let you know what we have. When we reproduce stuff for teachers, we do that as a service for teachers. For the general public, depending on the size of that request, we may charge a small fee for reproduction. But the reference desk can handle all of those questions when you make that request. And let me show you, I have, let's see, up here on the screen right now is the contact information for the front desk of the State Archives. That's who you would contact if you're a museum or if you're a private individual or a local historian or something like that. These are the folks who you contact to request copies of different things. They have, we've got a full-time reference staff. They're glad to get those requests. A lot of times for the smaller stuff, they'll waive the reproduction fee. But for the larger thing, if you're wanting to get a whole folder of stuff, then that's probably going to incur a reproduction fee.
Another question, are there census records on the site to show us how many people lived in the community during the war?
Census records, federal census records are not going to be available on Florida Memory. The 1940 census has, of course, recently been released, and that data is available on places like Family Search and Ancestry. It is not available on floridamemory.com. However, we do have a few select state census records, not for the World War II era, but for the 19th century. So, for example, we have an 1825 census of Leon County. We've got the 1855 census for Marion County hiding around in here. And we're just about, within the next month or so, going to have the mortality schedules for 1850, 60, 70, and 80 going up online probably by the end of February. Our Digital Volunteer Corps has been very diligently transcribing those, and we're so far ahead of schedule that I really do think that they'll be up within a month.
You're welcome, Lori. Does anybody else have any other questions? Any copyrights and permissions that school/district social studies educators should be aware of regarding the use of items from Florida Memory?
Absolutely. When we put something on Florida Memory, when it comes to photographs, we actually put on on each photograph, we put that it's in the public domain, because the photographs that are in our collection, as a condition of donating to the archives, we do require that the donor allow us to put those in the public domain. So the archives acquires the rights to those photos only so that we can then make those rights public. With documents, it's a little bit different. For the vast majority of the documents we hold, they're already in the public domain because they were produced by government entities, and that's going to be the case with all of the ones in our World War II unit that we've looked at today. You will occasionally find documents that were copyrighted at some point on Florida Memory, but for the most part, those are going to be prior to that 1924 date when the copyright has expired. You'll occasionally see some things that are a little later than that, things like brochures for tourist attractions where the corporation has been dissolved, and so that copyright's not really a thing anymore. But for the vast majority of documents, you're not going to have any copyright at all to deal with.
So it says most teachers and district team members are aware of federal, state, and district restrictions, but are not aware of how resources may be used for district assessments, multiple class use, etc.
That is a good point. If you have any questions about specific documents, I'd say just email us and we'll let you know what exactly we have. But again, for the vast majority of the documents that you're going to encounter on Florida Memory, and all of the ones that we've got in the World War II unit, all of those were either produced by government entities or they're private correspondence that was transferred to the archives, and the archives holds the rights, which means you, the people of Florida, own the rights. Then there's just not a copyright issue. But we are glad to field any questions about specific documents, and we'll get to the bottom of that.
Lori says, this was actually quite helpful. Thanks for sharing. I may find myself calling on you. Where did it go? I may find myself calling on you all in the near future. I'm trying to put together info about South Florida during the Cold War and life here in the 50s and 60s, as well as something on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll be in touch.
Very good. We'd love to hear from you.
Stacy says, thank you. Critically important to reinforce copyrights and permissions for classroom versus reproduction uses.
Certainly, absolutely. That's because you get into questions of fair use and that sort of thing. So the rights of a teacher showing something on the board or reproducing a document on a test, those permissions are going to be different from somebody who wants to reproduce a document or a photo in a book. But again, the vast majority of the documents in our learning units are going to have no copyright at all, just because of their provenance.
Great questions coming through. Does anybody else have any more questions for Josh and Katrina?
I see somebody furiously typing away. There we go. Awesome. Absolutely. Well, thank you guys, all of you, for being with us. And don't let this be the end. We certainly want to hear from you by email. We want to hear from you by phone. And, share the word that these resources are out there. These, archives belong to everyone. The material at the State Archives it's doing nobody any good just sitting on the shelves. We want to get it off the shelves and into your hands. So please let us know how we can help make that happen.
We're going to stay on for a couple more minutes to make sure that we've got all of your questions answered. But for those of you that have places to go and things to do, thank you for being on with us. And hopefully we'll see you guys online again soon.